Welcome back, everyone. We're diving deep into Fort Sumter this time.
Ah, Fort Sumter.
It's one of those iconic moments in American history.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of folks, they know the name, but maybe not the full story.
Right, it's the start of the Civil War, but what led up to that?
Yeah, exactly. So we've got diaries, military records, all sorts of accounts to paint a picture of what it was actually like back then.
It wasn't just about cannons and soldiers. There's a human side to this story.
For sure. So much tension, so many tough choices.
Exactly. So to get started, got to set the scene. It's 1860. The country's already split over slavery.
Right. That's been simmering for decades.
Then Lincoln gets elected. He's against slavery spreading. And that terrifies the South.
Especially South Carolina, right? They were the first to secede.
Yep. December 20th, 1860. They said, we're out of this union.
That must have been a shock to the system for the rest of the country.
Oh, absolutely. And right in the middle of all this, you've got Fort Sumter.
Sitting there in Charleston Harbor. Like a symbol, I guess.
More than that. It was a federal fort, still controlled by the U.S. Army.
Even though South Carolina had just said, see you later.
Exactly. So for them, it was like a thorn in their side, a reminder they hadn't fully broken away.
Talk about awkward.
Yeah.
And the guy in charge of the fort, Major Robert Anderson, talk about a tough spot.
Oh, man. A career soldier, but from Kentucky. Sympathetic to the South, but loyal to the Union.
Split right down the middle.
He was initially at Fort Moultrie, another fort nearby, but it was vulnerable to attack.
Those classic star forts. Good for fighting ships, not so much for land attacks.
And South Carolina was getting ready to make a move.
So Anderson's sitting there thinking, what do I do?
He makes a bold move. December 26, 1860, dead of night, he moves his entire garrison to Fort Sumter.
Wait, a secret mission? Under the cover of darkness?
Yep, boats rowing across the harbor, cannons spiked at Fort Moultrie, total secrecy.
Like something out of a spy movie. Outmaneuver them without firing a shot?
And it drove Charleston crazy. The tension just skyrocketed.
But what did President Buchanan do? He must have been freaking out.
He was in a bind, didn't want war, but couldn't just abandon Anderson.
Lose a fort, looks weak, emboldens the South even more.
So he tries to resupply the fort, sends an unarmed ship, the Star of the West.
Hoping to avoid any incidents.
Didn't work. January 9th, 1861, cadets from the Citadel opened fire on the Star of the West.
Whoa, cadets! They actually fired the first shots.
They did. Forced the ship to turn back, no serious damage, but the message was clear.
Yeah, things just went up a notch. Fort Sumter's basically under siege now.
Running low on supplies, Confederate troops gathering.
What was it like inside the fort? I mean, day-to-day life.
Tough. Fort Sumter was still being built, so it was more like a construction site with cannons.
Oh, wow. So not exactly comfy barracks and hot meals.
Nope. I read they were using socks to make gunpowder cartridges.
Wow, talk about making do. And all this while, the Confederates have Brigadier General P.G.T. Beauregard in charge.
Brilliant military engineer. But here's the twist. He and Anderson knew each other.
No way, really? Like how?
Beauregard had been Anderson's student at West Point. Mentor versus student.
Wow. Talk about a dramatic face-off. And all this happening as Lincoln's about to take office.
Talk about walking into a mess.
Yep.
Nation on the verge of collapse. Got to keep it together somehow.
An impossible situation, really. Decisions with consequences for millions.
Yeah, and that's just the start of it. We haven't even gotten to the bombardment itself.
Well, that's a story for another time.
We've only just scratched the surface here.
So Lincoln, right in the hot seat. Preserve the Union or risk it all falling apart?
And remember, this isn't just politics. Real people are stuck in the middle of this.
The soldiers, the folks in Charleston, families torn apart.
Yeah, it's easy to forget that human side of things.
Back to Fort Sumter, then. Low on supplies, Confederates ready to pounce. What's next?
By April, it's getting critical. Anderson sending desperate messages to Washington.
We need food, we need help.
Basically, Lincoln knows he has to do something.
Does he send in the troops? Full-on rescue mission.
Not quite. He decides to send supplies, food, and stuff, but no extra soldiers or weapons.
Trying to walk that fine line.
It was a huge risk, trying to help without looking like he's picking a fight.
But the Confederates saw it differently.
Oh yeah, for them, it was a slap in the face, a violation of their territory.
You're messing with our independence.
Exactly. So they make their move. April 11th, 1861, Confederate guys show up at Fort Sumter.
Delivering that ultimatum, right? Surrender or else.
Anderson's got an impossible decision to make.
Yeah, if he gives up, it's a win for the Confederacy. Maybe more states secede.
But if he fights, he's probably going to lose, and it could start a war.
Such pressure on this one guy's shoulders.
He's a soldier, but he's also a human being torn between loyalties.
So what does he do?
He refuses to surrender, buys some time for Lincoln, but at a huge cost.
And that's what leads to the first shots, right?
Yeah, April 12, 1861, 4:3 in the morning, a mortar shell explodes over Charleston Harbor.
Chills, man, chills. Everything changes in that instant.
No, going back now.
Yeah.
The piece is shattered.
What was it like? The bombardment itself.
Total chaos. People watching from Charleston, shells flying, cannons roaring.
Those old eyewitness accounts must be incredible.
Oh, they are. You can practically smell the smoke and feel the fear.
Talking about individuals caught in this, there was this guy, Edmund Ruffin.
Oh, yeah, a hardcore secessionist. Traveled all the way from Virginia just to see this.
Wow, that's dedication.
He actually fired one of the first shots. Can you imagine that feeling?
Talk about being on the wrong side of history. But inside the fort, Anderson and his men.
They knew they were in trouble. Outnumbered, outgunned, just trying to survive.
Every explosion shaking the fort, fires breaking out.
And they weren't just using regular shells. They had heated shot, red-hot cannonballs.
Trying to set the whole place on fire.
Fort Sumter was strong, but it wasn't finished yet.
So all this pounding was taking its toll?
Big time. Walls crumbling, guns getting knocked out.
Was there a moment where they knew it was over?
Well, the Confederates kept hitting the flagpole almost like a game.
Trying to break their spirit?
And eventually, they knocked it down completely. Some thought Anderson was giving up.
Enter Colonel Lewis Wigfall.
This guy, he sees the flag down, and he just rows out to the fort.
Under a white flag, right in the middle of the bombardment.
He basically tells Anderson, hey, it's over, let's call it a truce.
Talk about bold. And Anderson, he's exhausted, out of options.
He agrees to the truce, thinking it's the honorable way out.
But back on the Confederate side, not everyone's happy.
Chaos and confusion. Beauregard hadn't authorized any truce.
Wigfall went rogue.
Big time. Some were furious. Anderson even threatened to start shooting again.
So close to it all falling apart right there.
But in the end, Beauregard agreed to the terms.
So after all that, Fort Sumter falls. But it was way more complicated than just a surrender.
It was a mess, symbolic of the whole war, really.
It marked the beginning, the point of no return.
A nation divided. And that's where we'll pick up next time.
The aftermath, the war itself, it all starts here. Okay, so we've seen how it all went down at Fort Sumter, the decisions, the tension, the bombardment itself.
Yeah, a lot led up to those first shots, and a lot came after.
Right, it wasn't just a one-and-done thing. So what happened next? How did the rest of the country react?
Well, it was huge news, obviously, spread like wildfire.
People must have been glued to the newspapers, word of mouth, anything they could get.
Imagine that, a nation on edge, suddenly, bam, it's war.
In the North, I bet there's a lot of anger, a feeling of betrayal almost.
Oh, definitely. A lot of folks had hoped for a peaceful solution, compromise, something.
But Sumter kind of made it clear that wasn't happening.
It was a wake-up call. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to fight.
And people actually signed up, like willingly.
Oh, yeah, tons of them. Patriotism, outrage, wanting to defend the Union, all sorts of reasons.
It's hard to grasp that from our perspective today.
Yeah, but back then, it was a defining moment. And in the South, they had their own take on it.
They saw it as self-defense, right?
Yeah.
Protecting their way of life.
Exactly. The North started it. That was their view.
So Sumter basically cemented the divide.
Mm.
No more gray areas. You were either north or south.
And it just kept escalating from there.
But Fort Sumter itself, it didn't just fade into the background, did it?
Not at all. Charleston Harbor was valuable, and the Confederates controlled it.
So the Union wanted it back.
Oh, yeah. They launched several attacks to try and retake Sumter.
I can imagine those battles, fierce fighting, high stakes.
Sumter became a symbol, almost like a prize to be won.
A constant reminder of what was lost and what both sides were fighting for.
But there's a kind of hopeful ending to this whole Sumter story.
Oh. Tell me more.
4 years after the surrender, April 14th, 1865, Major Anderson goes back to Fort Sumter.
By this point, the war's over, right?
That's ended, yeah. And Anderson, he's a major general now, but he goes back to where it all began.
What did he do?
He raised the American flag, the same one he had to take down 4 years earlier.
Wow. Talk about a full circle moment. Poetic, almost.
It was. A symbol of the Union restored, a victory hard won.
But even with the war over, things weren't magically fixed, were they?
Nope. The country was still deeply divided. Scars take time to heal.
That's a good point. We often focus on the battles and the dates, but the human cost lingers.
Yeah, and we can't forget that. Fort Sumter, it's a story of choices, consequences, and the enduring impact of conflict.
Well said. I think we've all learned a lot today about Fort Sumter.
More than just the start of the Civil War.
It's a story that keeps unfolding, even now, all these years later. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Fort Sumter. It's a story that never gets old, full of twists and turns and reminders that history isn't just dates and names. It's about people, choices, and the echoes of those choices that we still hear today.